Good morning, namaskar, everyone. Well, let me start out by first saying that, of course, I'm going to bring the economist's lens to this concern. I think there are two key things that the report also highlights largely, but also what the Sherpa just mentioned and reiterated a few times. There are two things happening which make India's ambition for green transition particularly troublesome and difficult. One is, and they're both to do with the opportunity cost of number one, we perhaps are amongst the poorest countries attempting to make this very significant transition at such low levels of per capita income. If you look at the ambition and the targets that we are committing ourselves to, it is very important to understand that the opportunity cost for a low middle income country to make these commitments is much higher than it is for a richer country or for a middle income country. So we are trying to do all of this and incur these transitions and these costs at levels which are low, and that needs to be reiterated because low income levels mean that there will be it's their own set of political economic consideration. And the second is, in the last 10 years, largely stemming from the US China trade war, but now increasingly because of course what is happening in Europe, you're also seeing that the global supply chain and the value chain, the way it is under disruption, is also adding to a lot of anti globalization movements across countries, which means the kind of protectionist policies that Mr. Khan spoke about, one has to battle those as well. And cost of capital, of course, becomes a very key component in that. So, and we don't know what the end game of the European situation right now is, but that disruption is likely to only continue in the near foreseeable future. So we'll have to find solutions out of that. Now, three core points beyond the context that I just laid out that I'd like to focus on is one, and I see this often with, first of all, congratulations on the report. I think this is the first time I'm seeing a coherent strategy emerge in terms of a dollar value. And of course, the dollar value is significant compared to the 100 billion, which was the collective commitment of the richer nations, and we of course want 9 times that amount. So it just tells you the gap between what is required and what is available, and also the gap between pledge and eventually cash that we are seeing happen at the international level. So first is, while there is an emerging strategy and there is clarity around it, when we say retrain labor or it is a problem, we are seeing country after country where the aftermath of the distributional impact of globalization, you're seeing that there is a movement away from free trade. There are countries which are seeing emergence of right-wing economic policies on account of the fact that the distribution impacts of globalization are very real. It's not easy to retrain and re-employ people away from sectors that they are committed to or used to. So it's not just the fixed cost in terms of policy intervention, it is really time consuming. The transformation we want in terms of retraining, reallocating labor force is a very real concern, and it's not going to be a very easy fix. I think that is going to become one of our sticking points, particularly because we have struggled with labor laws. Governments after governments have continued to struggle in reforming labor laws. So you can imagine that trying to move away and retrain a large chunk of workers, particularly across districts which are aspirational districts. So these are some of our worst performing in terms of development districts. So in those places, the tensions are going to be that much more. The second is in terms of the financing instruments themselves. I think while we know we have some clarity, these are back of the envelope calculations, I know, and that is where we have to begin. But we have to get far more into the details of what will be the nature of the financial instruments required to deploy these kind of finances. So, for instance, if we are talking about green bonds, or what is green finance? The lexicon and exactly what construes green finance, even globally, we have to develop that clarity in terms of classifying, measuring, and then eventually indexing it to the different instruments that we are interested in. And I think that becomes like the first stepping stone. It's a baby step, but there is no moving beyond that in terms of implementation if we do not all agree on the details of what construes green finance. So we need to get into the details of developing the language, developing the financial language in terms of then operationalizing what are top level commitments and requirements. The third point that is of a greater concern and something that I have been working on for some time now is the energy security itself. All major economies, it's not only now, and it hasn't just started with the COP conversations. Major economies like US and China have been attempting to wean away from imports for some time now. This has been a 2 decade long conversation, and the US has brought it down to about 9% of its total energy consumption dependent on exports, and China has also now stabilized it around 15, 16%. Now, for India, which is, of course, the poorest amongst these major economies, our dependence is around 35, 36%, which is a very large number, and we show no sign of stagnating. So, our energy dependence on imports continues to rise on account of the fact that we are a $2,200 per capita per annum economy. So, an economy at this phase of growth is going to be hungry and energy hungry, and we will have to do what it takes to meet those energy demands. So, one has to understand the pressures of energy security with the added aspirations and pressures of the green transition that we are attempting to make. Now, one small point, just adding to when Mr. Chandrabhushan mentioned that a lot of action is happening in the states. In fact, we are concluding a survey of 8,000 firms, largely because I think Delhi, at the Delhi level, there is a conversation which I think is converging on certain key factors. I think we all agree, and this is a little bit like preaching to the choir. But the real action in terms of operationalizing a lot of these policies, it's happening at the state level. Now, it's not happening at every state level. Some states are far more proactive. In fact, the survey that we are doing, based on the annual survey of industries, that's the framework we are using, because we do want representation of not just large, but we want to look at the small and medium enterprises as well. That might be due to the incentives that the state governments are giving or the central government giving. Are they investing into this kind of a transition? And the early findings basically tell us that almost all the action is really concentrated in 5 or 6 states of the country. So a lot of what nationally we are trying to aspire, I think a lot of those conversations, at least from the transitioning at the firm level, is concerned. And I'm not talking about energy sector. I'm talking about MSMEs and large firms and what kind of investments they are making to transition towards greener technology and towards renewable and away from fossil fuels, etc. A lot of action is in 5 to 6 states. That is number one. Number two, on a more positive note, there is a bottom up approach that several states are taking as well. That while Delhi has these larger national ambition and aspirations, we have a poor state like Madhya Pradesh basically conducting a district by district measure of the green cover or the biodiversity cover. And this is being done through the Indian Institute of Forest Management with help from international scholars, etc. But the idea is that eventually, if you don't have a good measure of what the green cover at the local level is, which is what the valuable asset here is, and this is what we want to index in terms of then raising green finance or indexing it to carbon footprints, etc. We have to start by at least measuring what the lay of the land is. So Madhya Pradesh has started to do this exercise a year and a half back, and we are hoping to have a good measure at the district level in another 6 to 7 months. I know that the state of Meghalaya, again in the northeast, is doing a very similar exercise in terms of mapping its green cover, because again, the idea is to raise finance against it and be able to deploy it at the local level. I don't know how many of you in the room are aware, India is perhaps one of the very few countries, perhaps the second country, to have a social stock exchange, which means we are developing institutions which will help us deploy, first of all, raise and deploy capital. So it is not a regular stock exchange where instruments are traded. This becomes a place where there is a matching of the supply and demand for green finance. And there is also a development. When I talk about lexicon, we are trying to develop a coherent a dictionary for what green finance ought to be and how do we measure in terms of attaining some of these objectives. What are the exact indicators that we have to measure and scrutinize and audit from a longer term perspective. So my time is up. I just wanted to get into some of the weeds and the details of the conversation. Thank you.